Thank you all for coming. So I want to start my presentation with this quote from Bill Gates, who said, "Speech is not just the future of Windows, but is the future of computing itself." And now I'd like to show you a video clip that I think manifests this idea. So I'm going to show you the personal assistant Siri that's now on the iPhones.
Read me the message.
New message from Sebastian. Great news. We got the go-ahead. Can you meet at 10?
Reply. Definitely. I'll see you there. Play my running mix.
What's the traffic like around here?
Here's the traffic.
Text my wife, I'm gonna be 30 minutes late.
Is it going to be chilly in San Francisco this weekend?
Not too cold. Maybe down to 61 degrees in San Francisco.
What about Napa Valley?
Doesn't seem like it.
How many cups are in 12 ounces?
Let me think. Okay, here you go.
Set my timer for 30 minutes.
Okay, 30 minutes and counting. New notification from messages. Sandy Chen, are we still on for dinner tonight?
Reply. Sure, I'll be there.
Here's your reply to Sandy Chen. Sure, I'll be there.
Send.
Okay, so that video clip shows several speech technologies. You had speech recognition, and then Siri went beyond speech recognition to speech understanding, that is, recognizing certain keywords and then determining what tasks to do. And then you had speech synthesis, which is one of the ways Siri communicates with you. So there, of course, Siri worked very well. There have been some tests, not really scientific, but show that Siri recognizes things correctly about 89% of the time in quiet, about 83% of the time in noisy environments. And I don't know what the signal-to-noise ratio was in those noisy environments. They were on the streets of Minneapolis. And then she responds, she's able to get the right answer for you about 68% of the time in quiet and 63% of the time in noise. So while this is really a big advance and it has given a real big boost to speech recognition technology, we still have quite a ways to go. So I want to now talk about the human speech communication process to put this into context. Okay, so on the left we have the speaker. And the speaker starts off at the linguistic level where they decide what words they're going to say, and then they organize those words according to the grammar. And those words are made up of syllables. Those syllables are made up what we call phonemes in speech terminology. And phonemes are the individual sounds that you say. The brain sends signals to the muscles to then move the articulators around to produce those words. Okay, so that's the physiological level. Then you have air that flows up through your lungs. It gets modulated and then filtered by the vocal tract based on the position of the articulators to produce the sound wave. So now we're at the acoustic level, okay? And this whole system here that I just went through is what's simulated by speech synthesis, or speech synthesis technology. Now that sound wave goes into the listener's ear. That's pressure fluctuations of the air that goes into the listener's ear, and that activates the hearing mechanism. So then we go back to the physiological level. Signals get sent up to the brain, and then the listener retrieves those words from their lexicon so they can then recognize those words and understand those words. So again, you're back at the linguistic level here. So this is a very complicated process. There are a lot of systems involved in speech communication, and there's a great deal of research going on in all of those systems. And while we have learned a great deal over the years, there's still a lot of work to do. So I just want to say to my students who are interested in this area, there's still a lot to be done. And so I hope that you all will consider this as a possible area. Okay, so, and then to say that this listener side of the human speech communication process is what is simulated by the speech recognition part. Okay. Oops. Don't worry about that. Okay, so now let me give you an overview of what I'm going to talk about today. I'm going to only be able to touch on 3 areas of my research: speech production, speech recognition, and speech enhancement. However, before I talk about those areas, I'm going to give you some background knowledge. That'll be the teaching part of my lecture today. So you can have a framework for understanding the research that I'm going to discuss. However, there's a lot of other research that I won't get a chance to talk to you today, but I thought I'd give you an overview of my research program. So I've done several other speech production studies that I won't get a chance to talk about. I've also done research in speaker recognition, research in improving assistive technologies like the artificial larynx device and hearing aids, and then I've also done research in forensics. Okay, so now let me give you some background. So here we start with a mid-sagittal view of the human vocal tract. So air flows up through the lungs, and it gets modulated by some muscles here right behind your Adam's apple. And the opening between these muscles is called the glottis, and you'll hear me use that term quite a bit. Then the air flows up through the vocal tract, and it can either go out of the nose or it can go out of the mouth. Given the position of this uvula and velum, which is what you see when you open your mouth in the mirror, air will flow in both directions. But for most of the sounds that we produce, we position this velum up against the wall here so that air is only coming out of the mouth. And now we change that air, we filter that air based on the position of the articulators, which are your lips, your teeth, your jaw, and then we can move different parts of our tongue independently. The apex, which is the tip of the tongue, we can do the middle of the tongue or the root of the tongue, and we can do them in combination. And then we can also make closures here, somewhere in this oral part of the vocal tract, and have air that just goes solely out of the nose. So the velum is also an articulator. So now for my 322 students who are here, I'm going to model this production system as an excitation signal that's coming up through my glottis, through those vocal cords. Then the filter that's formed by how I position my articulators. And of course, this is a time varying system, right? Because we're always moving our articulators around as we speak. However, for a short period of time, we can say that it's time invariant. So then we can take advantage of all those techniques that you're learning in my class. Okay, so we have the vocal tract filter, then that gets radiated, that sound coming out of the mouth, to then produce the speech signal. And so for my students, the speech signal is going to be the convolution of the excitation signal with the vocal tract, impulse response, and then the radiation signal. Okay, if we take the Fourier transform, of course, we are multiplying those. Okay, so that was a side for my students. Okay, so now I'm going to show you a spectrogram and a waveform of the speech utterance, what joy there is in living. On top, you see the time waveform, and on the bottom is what we call a spectrogram. And a spectrogram is a two-dimensional representation of this signal that you see here. Along the horizontal axis is time, so these two are time aligned. But on the vertical axis here is frequency. And this is going up to like 5,000 hertz here. The darkness of the ink here is showing you the energy at those frequencies. So now I'm showing you how that these resonances, which is the darkness in the bands here, how those change as you speak. The red one is what we call the first resonant frequency, or in speech terminology is called F1, or the first formant frequency. The blue one is showing you what's called the second resonant frequency, or F2, or the second formant frequency. And then the green here is the third resonant frequency, F3, or the third formant frequency. What you can see here is F1 does not move a great deal, but there's a lot of variability in the frequency of F2. It's as low as maybe 600 or 700 hertz here, and as high as maybe 2200 hertz here. So it varies over a wide range. F3 stays pretty flat, except during this particular sound here, and we're going to come back and talk about that sound later when I talk about speech production, and that's the American English R sound. Okay, so I just wanted to give you an idea about speech, and you can see a lot of things are changing as we speak. You see here, this looks very different from what you see here. There's sort of really abrupt changes going on as this person is speaking. So there is a lot of landmarks in speech. Okay, so now what I want to do is first focus on the excitation signal used to produce speech. Here, this is a high-speed video camera that's being put down this person's throat. I think you're getting 4,000 video images per second here. And on that basis, we're able to see the vocal cords. And that's what you see here. And just to position it, this front part is at the front part of the neck, and up here is at the back part of the neck. Okay? So now I want to show you how this sounds and how these vocal cords move as you speak. So I don't know if I can just, no, let me go here. And now look at how the vocal cords vibrate as that person produced that sound. So you can see there's periodic motion of the vocal cords. And the thing to note is that the vocal cords don't just do this, they're doing this. I don't know if you can see that, but the bottom part comes up and then it comes up like that. So a schematic of that is shown here, where initially, and this is from a dog's larynx, but initially the vocal cords are shut, air pressure builds up, and it starts to force them apart. The bottom part separates first, and then it moves up, and you finally get the top part coming apart. And then they're maximally open here. You get a Bernoulli effect, and then that forces the vocal cords to slam shut again. And then this cycle repeats as you talk. So this is just showing that the lower surface opens first, and then the upper surface of the vocal cords. This is just showing you the volume velocity of the air coming through those vocal cords. So initially nothing is coming through, then they start to open up, and let me highlight that. So just to correspond with the phases up there, initially they're closed, and they start to open, maximally open, like at 4 here, and then they slam shut. And then this cycle repeats itself. And the thing to note is that the closure part is a lot more abrupt than the opening part. So for my 322 students, the impulse that we see in class, that's not realizable. But this is an example of impulsive behavior. So that closure is what excites the vocal tract. Okay, so let me, and then the period between when this signal repeats is related to the mass and the compliance of the vocal folds. And again, for my 322 students, M is like an inductance and C is like a capacitor. So that's resonant frequency that you've learned about in your electric circuit theory class. Okay, so again, I'm showing here the excitation signal here. It closes shut, it acts like an impulse, and then you get the response from the vocal tract. This is the speech signal. It shuts again, and you get that again. So this is again for my 322 students. This is a periodic signal, so its Fourier transform will have a line spectrum. Energy at the fundamental and multiples of the fundamental. Okay? And this is showing you that pitch frequency, And it has a different range for male speakers versus female speakers. For males, it starts around, 60 hertz and goes up to about 200 hertz with a mean around maybe 125. For females, about 160 up to about 400 with a mean around, say, 250. Something like that, okay? But as we talk, we're constantly changing that pitch period. Otherwise, we would sound monotone, okay? Okay, so now just variability in that glottal source. Most of the time, most of us are operating here. But some of us are very breathy people, and we talk like Marilyn Monroe. And so our volume velocity waveform looks like this, where we always keep it open so that it doesn't close. You get this DC flow. That DC flow gives you some aperiodicity at the high frequencies here, relative to just having really nice harmonic structure all the way through for the modal voice, okay? And it's more low frequency. This is more sinusoidal, okay? And then we have what's called a pressed voice. So let me play these for you so you can have an idea of what these sound like. So this is modal voice. It's the one that you heard before. This is breathy voice. And some of you may know people that talk like that. And then all of us sometimes have breathiness. And then this is creaky voice. And some of you may know people that talk like that. I actually have a colleague that's always creaky. Okay? Okay. And then, so that's when the source is at the glottis. But the source can be further forward in the vocal tract. So this is modeling the glottis here. And now you form a constriction somewhere above the glottis. And you make it narrow enough to generate noise. So, like that. Okay? And you direct that airflow against an obstacle, which can be your teeth, to make it even more salient. And of course, that's not a periodic source. So you get a spectrum here that's fairly flat. I mean, that's continuous and fairly flat. Okay, so that's another kind of excitation signal that we use when we speak. So now let me move on to talking about the vocal tract. So we moved away from the source to talking about the vocal tract. And the vocal tract is a filter, a multi-resonator, okay? It consists of different peaks, and the locations of these peaks, these resonances, are determined by how you shape the vocal tract. Here I'm contrasting the E sound with the Ah sound. And what you can see is that the E sound, the tongue body is close to the roof of the mouth, whereas for the Ah, you're wide open in the front. The tongue is lowered. So you see a big difference here in that first resonant frequency because of that difference. When it's close to the mouth, we call that a high position. That means it has a low F1. And when it's low, you have the tongue lowered, you have a much higher F1 position. So this is like 300 hertz versus 800 hertz. The other difference you see here is that here the tongue body is towards the front of the mouth. So the pharynx part, or the back part of the vocal tract, is wide open. Whereas here the tongue is towards the back of the mouth, and you can see is narrowed back here. So we call this back versus front. And that has to do with the positioning of the second formant. Here for this wide open pharynx, F2 is above 2000 hertz. Whereas here for the Ah, where you have the narrowing in the back, F2 is like around 1000 hertz. So these two are very close together, where here they're a lot further apart. Okay? So it's this kind of information, along with the source information, where at MIT we learn how to read those spectrograms and actually determine what sounds people said. Okay? Now, to show you about speech variability, I'm showing you a plot of F2 versus F1. I talked to you about E and Ah, but you can see there are a lot of vowels in between and around in here. And this ellipse is encompassing the data for about 90% of the speakers, which there are a lot of males and females. So that shows you that the actual value of F2 and F1 varies a lot depending upon the speaker. And here we're seeing a line showing the centroid for females versus males, just to show that females have higher resonant frequencies than males because we have a shorter vocal tract. And then this is another slide for my 322 students. So For most of the sounds that we produce, the source is here at the glottis where the vocal folds are vibrating, so that the source has a line spectrum because it's periodic. We have this multi-resonator, the vocal tract, and those are the different resonances, F1, F2, F3, F4. Then we have the radiation characteristics. This is all in the frequency domain, so I'm going to multiply them. So when you actually look at the speech signal, it's going to be periodic, you see the line spectrum, and it's going to have these resonances that are determined by the vocal tract, which means the position of your articulators, your lips, your teeth, your tongue, your jaw, and so on. On the other hand, for a lot of the consonants, we make constrictions somewhere in the vocal tract. In this case, I'm making the constriction up here behind what's called my alveolar ridge, kind of behind my teeth. So it creates this turbulent source. It's not periodic, so it's continuous, doesn't have the lines. And I'm only exciting that part of the vocal tract in front of the source. So the first resonance I see here is F4. I don't see F1, F2, F3. I see F4. Radiation characteristics, and then this is what that speech signal will look like. So sometimes for a lot of the vowel sounds, it's going to be periodic, a lot of energy down low. For a lot of the consonant sounds, you have mainly your energy up high. Okay, so we'll look at a spectrogram again and see those differences. Now I want to share a framework with you that linguists developed called phonetic feature theory, because it helps to build a framework for how to think about speech in some of the research that I've done. Linguists have come up with about 20 or so phonetic features that describe all of the sounds in all of the languages in the world. They're based on the position of the articulators, and they are the minimal units needed to distinguish between sounds. So remember I told you about phonemes, those are the individual sounds, but you can go a level below that to these phonetic features. So for example, the only difference between the z and zip versus the s and sip is that my vocal folds vibrate when I say z, they don't vibrate when I say s. Otherwise, these sounds are produced exactly the same. So it's only the source feature that's different. The only difference between t and tip versus s and sip is that I make a complete closure when I say t, but in s, I just make a narrow constriction. So that's the only difference when I say those sounds. And we call that a difference in manner phonetic features. So manner phonetic features are related to how open or closed is your vocal tract. For vowels, we don't make any major constrictions. However, for the consonants, we can either make a narrow constriction, or we can make a complete closure, or we may not make a narrow, well, here we make a complete closure like here, but we lower the velum so that the air is coming completely out of the nose. That's for the nasal sound. Okay? And then, so we characterize sounds in terms of whether the vocal folds vibrate or not, how open or closed is the vocal tract, and then finally, where is the closure in the vocal tract? So here for b and p, you make a closure at the lips. For d and t, you make a closure here behind the teeth. For g and k is even further back in the velum region that you make the closure. And then you have these different places for the fricatives. So I just wanted to give you that framework, because I'll come back to that. So now I'm giving you this utterance again, what joy there is in living. Now hopefully you can understand this a lot better. All these regions where you have low frequencies, these are like vowel-like regions. These regions where you don't have low frequencies but mainly high frequencies, those are your consonant regions. And then these vertical striations you see, that's because the vocal folds are periodically vibrating. Okay. Oh, so now that's the end of my teaching part. I'm now gonna talk about my research, one project in speech production. And I'm coming back to this sound where the third resonant frequency goes very low. So speech scientists have come up with a lot of models to understand how different sounds are produced, why sounds look the way they do. However, for some sounds, people could only speculate. We did not really know exactly how they were produced. There are a lot of ideas out there. However, with the advent of magnetic resonance imaging, we were able to get a better handle on it because we could visualize what the position of the articulators and make measurements. And so I did a study with several colleagues in looking at American English R, and we collected data from 22 subjects. And here I'm showing, and this is just saying the American English R. So they lay in this MRI device and they go, they hold it, and we're just taking all of these images. And we're taking images in 3 dimensions: sagittally, axially, and then coronally, okay? And based on, and I'm showing you the ends of the continuums for the R. This R sound is produced with the tongue tip up and the dorsum down. This R is sound is produced with the tip down but the dorsum up. But you hear them exactly the same. So this is called a retroflexed R, and this is called a bunched R. And now if you look at those first 3 formant frequencies, they look the same for both of these sounds. So people have often said there's this many-to-one mapping between articulation and acoustics. Okay, so we wanted to understand, first of all, why this R had this low third resonant frequency. So first of all, what these 3 R's have in common, and people had already noted this, is that you have this narrowing at the lips, you have this constriction along the palate. In this case is made with the tongue, in this case is made with the dorsum, and then you have this narrowing in the pharyngeal region. So these 3 kind of narrowings are needed. However, what is more important is that you have this really large volume behind the lips. And just to show you the difference here, I put up, here it is, the ah sound, and ah often occurs right before an R, so like in bar. And you can see that the tongue is lying flat in the mouth. You don't have this large volume, this hole here that you're seeing for the R. And that large volume with, and people had knew that this was important, but what's more important is not that you just have the large volume, but you also have to have the narrowing of the lips. It's that combination that gives you the lowering in the third formant. Okay, so with Xinwei Zhao, who's was one of my PhD students and is now a postdoc with me, we did 3D reconstructions of the vocal tract. This was very important to Xinwei, because in doing this 3D reconstruction, you don't make any assumptions about what's going on, like plane wave propagation or anything. Instead, you have to do the image processing, which is very time consuming, from all these images in 3 directions and put them together. So this was a major undertaking for Xinwei. And so you can see we could look at this volume from all sides. The outline here is showing you that tongue tip up, and then the pink is showing you how the air can flow. From that 3D geometry, we could now compare various models. So we have the MR image. From the image, we went through to the 3D geometry. From the 3D geometry, we then extract the area functions. A lot of people go straight from here to area functions, but Xinwei thought it very important to go here first. You get about 70 little uniform tubes here to represent the areas. So for example, this large volume right here, that's shown here. So this goes here, this is the lip, that's the lip, glottis here. And then what's really important, and this is a very engineering thing for my students, is that we simplified this even further to just 4 tubes. We're always looking to see how can we simplify things so we can get an intuition and model things, and then we can build on it. Okay? So if we look at the acoustic response we get from these various models, here is the natural utterance. Here's from the 3D geometry using finite element modeling. Here's from those 70 area functions that came from the 3D model. And then here's from the 4 simple tubes. We went from 70 tubes down to 4 here. And that's shown in red. And we overlaid it with here so you can see the agreement. And you can see it's a pretty good model. Just going to those 4 tubes. And why is that important? Because now, from this 4-tube model, we can now say which tube results in what resonant frequency. So we found that F1 comes from this big volume here and this little neck here. This configuration has a special name called a Helmhose Resonator. And those 2 tubes together give you F1. This big tube here with the little neck in front, that gives you the second resonant frequency. Okay? And then it's this back cavity right here that gives you the 3rd, 4th, and 5th resonant frequencies. That's why they're evenly spaced. So now we can understand the relationship of these formants to the shape of the vocal tract. Now we can understand why the signal looks the way it does based on how it's produced, how you position your articulators. Okay, so that's why the low F3. Now, when I was doing my PhD thesis, which involved recognizing this R sound, it's very fascinating, this American English R sound. So again, here I'm showing you 3 R's in the word warav. This is the lowering of the 3rd formant. I had noticed in my dissertation that different things are happening at high frequencies. In this case, F4 and F5 are straight. In this case, F4 takes a nosedive like F3, but then F5 stays straight. In this case, F4 is taking a nosedive, and so is F5. They're both following F3. And I remember bringing this to the attention of some of my colleagues at MIT, and they all said, oh, just ignore what's going on up there because you can't hear those formants anyway. They're too low in amplitude. So I did. I ignored them at the time. But as a professor here, I decided to investigate this. And so Shin Wei looked at this for me. And what we found is that the space in between F4 and F5 tells you about which shape the person used to produce the R. So that many to one thing that people had always felt is true is not true. If you look in the higher formants, you can figure out what's going on. So in the case of this retroflex R, we get something like a 1500 hertz difference here between F4 and F5. For the bunched R, it's only like an 800 hertz difference. And you may say, why do we care about that? Well, this is really good information if you want to do speaker recognition, because people don't know what they're doing when they produce this sound. They can't go from here to here. Believe me, we've tried to train people to do that, and they can't do it reliably. So this is information that nobody can change about themselves. It's reliable information that you can count on if you want to do speaker recognition. So if I have a recording that I know is Osama bin Laden, then I want to know if this is him. That's one thing I can do and see, is he producing his R's in the same way? Okay? All right. So this information about R, I had done, Suzanne Boyce, who is a professor at University of Cincinnati, was part of that study that I did on R, and she's a speech therapist. She took that information and she was able to train people who others had previously given up on. They had worked with them for 2 to 3 years to try to get them to produce an R with no luck. And in an average length of time of 9 weeks, she got them all producing an R. And let me tell you why. So Suzanne has worked with 68 clients. Most of them are children. She's currently working with 2 more. And the idea was this idea. You have to have these 3 constrictions. And most speech therapists had only tried to make sure that you had this palatal constriction. And in fact, most speech therapists only taught about this retroflex R. They're not even taught about the bunched R. So if you're doing this, they're trying to get you to go there, which is not a good thing. But what Suzanne noticed is that over 2/3 of her clients are not making this pharyngeal narrowing. So she worked on showing them a picture of their tongue using ultrasound and getting them to make that pharyngeal narrowing. And now this is a little bit more technical, but for the engineers and my students in the audience, this is the half wavelength resonator that F3, F4, and F5 come from. I showed you that earlier. If you look, remember F3 is the first resonance of this back cavity. If you look at the standing wave pattern for the volume velocity for the first resonance of that back cavity, which is F3, you can see you have a maximum for the volume velocity here in the middle. And if you make a constriction in this region, it will lower that resonance. And so you can get a 300 hertz lowering in an F3 by putting that pharyngeal narrowing there. And so that is what Suzanne has taught her clients to do. So this is a child, and this is his bad R before she worked with him.
Lug.
He said lug, an L instead of an R. And now this is the good R.
Lug.
So let me play those again. I hope you can hear the difference. Okay. Now, one last thing I'm going to mention is a study that I'm doing with Dr. Maureen Stone, who's in the audience. She's a professor at the University of Maryland Dental School. And we're working with glossectomy patients. These are patients who have had a portion of their tongue removed due to cancer. Here I'm showing you a normal patient. This is a normal subject. Then this is one of the patients that had a tumor removed on the left here. And so the midline of this person's tongue is here. You can see how the midline is shifted here because they've cut out a portion of the tongue. So this part of the tongue here is actually what used to be on the side. It's rotated down. And then this person has a tumor that was cut on the right side of their tongue. So their tongue is bent that way. And often their speech intelligibility is affected, particularly for some of the consonant sounds. And so we've been taking some of the techniques we use to study R, the 3D geometries, and going to the area functions and really trying to understand what is impacting their intelligibility. In the interest of time, I'm not going to go into that, but just to let you know some follow-on work that has come from that. And that's an ongoing study. We're still doing that. So now I want to talk to you about speech recognition. Speech recognition is being used in a lot of ways now. Dictation systems. The two big core engines out there are by Nuance. That's the guts for Siri, the demo I did for you earlier. And then Microsoft has a speech recognition system that's actually open source for people right now. Recognition systems are being put in cars. And there's just a ton of other applications like Siri that you saw earlier. Okay, just a brief history of speech recognition research. In the beginning, it was really focused on speech science, and people came up with tried to figure out how to extract information related to those phonetic features that I talked about earlier to do recognition of speech. There were handcrafted rules that were put there. But then we had this 40-year history of what's called hidden Markov modeling. This is a very sophisticated statistical paradigm that has been used in speech recognition to great success. I mean, the recognition performance of these systems improved tremendously over this time course. However, we've hit a ceiling, and now we need to go back to the basics to figure out how to get beyond this ceiling and put this speech science into the recognition systems. These are some of the giants in the speech science world. I won't point all of them out except to point out this particular person who was my thesis advisor at MIT, Ken Stevens. And I had to put Catherine Harris here because in a lot of pictures she's omitted, but she has been very instrumental and important to the field. She was at Haskins Laboratories for many years. Okay, so let me talk about why speech recognition is so hard, why we don't have a system that anybody can go and talk to just like we're talking to another person. And that's because there's so much variability in speech. When you say something twice, you never say it exactly the same way. I'm going to talk about first co-articulation, which is something that all of us do that makes speech recognition hard. It doesn't matter whether you have an accent, what language you speak, we all do this. And this is where we anticipate an upcoming sound. While we're saying the current sound, we also start to produce the upcoming sound so that we're overlapping them. And we can overlap them with varying degrees of strength. So, for example, this is the word African. This was taken from a database that I developed as part of my PhD work. And remember I said I was doing recognition of this R sound. So remember that low F3 for R. Now this R is supposed to occur after this F, right? And this is the region for the F. But you can see that this third resonance starts to lower almost immediately as the person says the A. Well before they even start to say the F, they're saying the R sound. You know, when this R is not supposed to be there, it's supposed to come after the F. Now we can do that because to produce the R means I have to put my tongue into a particular configuration. But for F, what I do with my tongue doesn't matter. I just have to make a constriction between my teeth and my lower lip and push noise through it. And I get the F. So I can do them both at the same time. And in fact, I can go in and put my tongue in a position for the R before I even make the constriction for the F. So this is the variability that you get in speech. That's one of the things. And this happens even, this person was reading. In fact, they weren't even reading. This was citation speech. Say African again. This is about as clear as you get, and they're still doing this. So you can imagine what happens when you're speaking casually to your friend, you're tired. The variability just gets extensive, okay? Now here's the next thing we can do. It's called lenition, just sloppy articulation. So here's the word every day, said over here very carefully, very carefully, where this V and this D, you see the frication noise here. For the D, you got this silence region where you see nothing, then all of a sudden this transient. This is clearly articulated. This is a person saying the same word, keep doing that. Saying the same word, and this V and the D look nothing like this V and D. But all they've done is instead of making a tight constriction, they just opened it up a little bit. And I get something in terms of a physical signal that looks nothing like this. These look like totally different animals. Now let me play this for you. Oops.
Every day.
Every day, and then this one.
Every day.
Every day. They're speaking faster, they're not making the constrictions as tight, and so you get something that just looks totally different. And we do this all the time. And in fact, not only do we have lenition going on here, we have that core articulation I talked about in African. F3 starts to lower immediately, even though it's supposed to come after the V. So both phenomena are going on there. Okay, so that's just to give you a hint. And now we haven't even talked about accents, you know, variability due to your size of your vocal tract, but you can already see that variability is just very extensive. So this is showing the difference in word error rate for human speech recognition versus automatic speech recognition systems. And you can see we have a long way to go in automatic speech recognition systems to get to the performance level that humans have. Okay, now some of the other limitations in current ASR technologies is that they're largely top-down. That is, they are based on, they do a very poor job of recognizing the individual sounds that you produce. However, they're able to do so well because they take advantage of what we call language models. That is, they say, what is the probability of this word occurring given the previous word? So they've gone out and they've analyzed a lot of text from newspapers and all kind of stuff to build these probabilistic models. If you don't have such a grammar, you get 70% error rate. That means you're only recognizing 30% of the words correctly. You put a grammar in there like that, it drops by an order of magnitude. Now you only have a 7% error rate. Okay? And now you say, what is the probability this word occurred given the two previous words? And you go from a 7% error rate to 4% error rate. So we're really relying a lot on these language models to help us to do a good job. Okay, and then the other problem is that you have to have a match between what you train on for these systems and what you recognize on. If you don't have a match in terms of the speakers, in terms of the transducers, meaning the microphones, in terms of the noise in the environment, then the performance gets very poor. This is just showing some results for a resource management task that only consisted of 1,000 words. That's not that large. And it has a very restrictive grammar. You can only put the words together in a certain way. For native speakers, 3.6% error rate. That's really good. However, you change those speakers to non-native speakers and you now have them talk over a telephone channel and it increases by an order of magnitude, the error rate. And then finally, just showing you in noisy environments, the difference between human performance and machine performance is very good and clean, or it can be. This is for read speech. But they drastically change the difference in performance as the noise level increases. Okay, so the way that current ASR systems try to deal with that first phenomenon that I talked about, which was core articulation, is that what they do, so here I've labeled, this is someone saying perfect memory very carefully. and I've labeled the individual sounds in this word. Instead of building models for these individual sounds, instead they build models for what's called triphones. That is, I'm going to build a model for this P that's preceded by silence and followed by an So in my training data, I'm going to find all the P's that are preceded by silence and followed by an and I'm going to model them together. And then I'm going to find the that are preceded by a P and followed by an F and model them all together. And while that gives you better recognition accuracy, or it can, the problem is data sparsity. Whereas you only have 60 phones, if you now try to have all these different triphones that take into account the previous and the following sound, you go from building models for 60 phones to building models for almost 10,000 elements. Okay? So you got to have enough data to be able to do that. So we need lots and lots and lots of training data. And a lot of the advances we've seen recently in speech recognition is because we're getting more and more training data. Simply improving because there's more data out there to train on. Now, the problem with this triphone model, let's go back to this African. If I built a model for this A, it's going to be for an A preceded by silence and followed by an F. Well, the largest influence on this A is an R. It's not even going to have information in there about an R. Okay? So that's the problem. The extent of the variability can be over several sounds. And in fact, what we found, I did a study with Suzanne Boyce, that most gestures, speech gestures, take about 200 milliseconds to produce. Oops. Meant to go back. Oops. What did I do? Sorry. Let's see what I just did. Okay, most gestures in speech, like making the gesture for the R, takes about 200 milliseconds. Moving your tongue forward or back, up and down, those things take time. And, you know, trying to build models with a much smaller extent is just not capturing core articulation well enough. Okay, so what have I been doing in speech recognition? Steve has already told you that I've been focusing in a very different way from most people. So let's look at an utterance. It's formed out of words, it's formed out of syllables, it's formed out of phonemes, but below the phonemes are the phonetic features, and then you can also say articulatory features. I'm going to talk about both of these because this is where I focused my research. I told you before that most of these recognition systems rely on language models. They're not doing a good job of trying to recognize those individual sounds, and that's where I've been trying to make an impact, is doing a much better job in recognizing those individual sounds. So in terms of speech recognition systems, the way they generally operate, is you have a speech signal, you parameterize it some way, you extract some kind of information, state of the art, or what we call male frequency Kepler coefficients. Instead of these, I've been focusing on those phonetic features and these articulatory features. The back-end systems have been those hidden Markov models I told you about that people have worked on a lot for 40 years. Instead, I've come up with a landmark-based system to go along with the phonetic features and a dynamic Bayesian network to go along with the articulatory features. And then you recognize the words. So I'm going to talk briefly about these. So I've arranged these phonetic features in a hierarchy where you have the most robust parameters at top. You can recognize the feature sonorency up to an 18 dB signal-to-noise ratio. And then they get less robust as you go down the tree. So looking at place features, like whether something is a labial, alveolar, or velar, is only robust to 0 dB SNR. And that's where you have the individual sounds is at the bottom of the tree. Okay, why am I interested in these phonetic features? Because remember I told you these V and D, in terms of the physical signal, they look like totally different animals. But if you look at them at the level of the phonetic features, the only difference in the V is one feature. All the rest of the features are the same. If you look at the difference between those two Ds, the only difference is in two features. The rest of them are the same. And me and my colleagues have observed over many years of doing analysis is that at most two features change. Even though at the physical level, those signals can look completely different. So that's why you have this sort of invariance at the phonetic feature level. So, and then the other important thing, remember I told you how people started off kind of using a speech science approach. But the problem is that people were basing their measures, they were absolute measures. So for example, if I wanted to distinguish between the S and the sh in seashore, you can see the difference here. This energy starts at 4,000, this starts at 2,000. So people may say, let me look in here in this range and see how much energy this is. If I have lack of energy, it's a S. If I have a lot of energy, it's sh. However, what exactly that range is going to vary across speakers. So if I look at a distribution here, you can see that that energy concentration is going to be very different for a male versus a female. However, if instead I base that measure, I change where I look based on that particular person's third formant frequency, then I can make the distributions a lot more alike. So I can remove a lot of speaker differences. So that was another reason why we went to phonetic features. So now I'm showing you a comparison of our phonetic features relative to the MFCCs, which are the state of the art, and an HMM back-end system. This is what everybody was doing. In order to get my work published for a while, I had to put it in an HMM framework. So what you see is if the training and the test data match, you know, the MFCCs are doing a little better than us. However, we don't have a full representation yet. If we add even one more feature, we get much closer. Okay, but now if you switch it, you train on females, recognize on males, train on males, females, adult, child, adult, that kind of thing, you can see that the performance using the MFCCs degrades drastically, whereas we do not. We're much more robust to the differences in speakers. So we demonstrated that. Then we looked at the back end and we said, let's implement that phonetic feature hierarchy. And for each node in the tree, we used a support vector machine, and we only put the information in that node that was needed, the acoustic parameters that were needed, and we put a probabilistic structure around that to do recognition. We compared that kind of system to the HMM that everybody has been using, and you can see we get very good comparison. This was based on a PhD thesis done in about 4 years. This is an HMM system worked on for about 40 years. So this is a very promising approach to speech recognition. However, I moved to actually looking at the articulatory features, and let me tell you why. So this is the word perfect memory set very carefully. Again, you got the waveform, then you have the spectrogram. And now, below that, I'm showing you what some of this articulatory data that was collected at the same time as the acoustic data. So, just looking in this region, first you have this measure that is looking at the constriction for the K, where you raise the tongue body up against the roof of the mouth. Then information here for the tongue tip, because you bring the tongue tip up for the T, and then you make the lip closure for the M. Okay, and you can see evidence for the K, the T, and the M. And there's the K, there's the T, and the M. Just believe me, I know you don't quite understand all of that. Now, this is said more casually, okay? And you don't see this little thing anymore. You can see how that's missing? That's because there's more overlap in this M with this K and this T. Now, at a rapid pace, let's go here, you don't even see the silence anymore. It just looks like the person said an M. Most people would say the K and the T have been deleted. However, if you look at what the articulators are doing, there's the rising of the tongue body for the K, rising of the tongue tip for the T, and the closure for the lip. But now notice they're much more overlapped here than they are here and here. And the other thing to note is, though, even though this person made the rising of the tongue for the T, they didn't rise it all the way up. Okay, they fell short of the target. But it's still there, the evidence is still there. So at the gestures level, the gestures are when you reach the targets, these little box regions. There's an invariance there that you don't have when you look at the physical signal. And it would be hard even to get at this information from the phonetic features. This is why I moved to looking at the gestures. Okay? So the problem well, let me explain this a little bit more first. So this is showing a schematic of the mid-sagittal view of the vocal tract with these tract variables there. Here you have the lip. You're looking at the upper and lower lip difference for lip, that tract variable. Then you have the tongue tip where you're looking at the difference between the tongue here and the roof of the mouth. Not only are you looking at this distance between the tongue tip and the roof of the mouth, but you also want to know where along here that constriction is made. Again, for the tongue body, you want to know if the velum is lowered or not, and you want to know what's happening at the glottis, or the vocal folds vibrating or not. So there are like 8 different tract variables here. So now the problem with this approach, okay, I got ahead of myself again. Okay, so what we want to do is, instead of going this way where you have speech production, is we're now going the reverse. We want to go from the speech signal back to that. So we want to do speech inversion. Now, I can say the problem with this is that there is no database out there that's annotated in terms of these tract variables. So you can't just train a system like this. So we had to create a database. I got together with colleagues at Haskins Laboratory who have developed a computational speech production model called TADA. It's a task dynamic model. And TADA produces synthetic speech, as well as it will give you the gestures and those tract variables. So we took the X-ray microbeam database that was developed at Wisconsin that does have articulatory information in it. And we synthesized 420 of those words. We could check and make sure the information we got here agreed with here. And we produced a synthetic speech. And now we use that database to develop a speech inversion system to go from the physical signal to those tract variables. And those are those smooth parameters, those smooth parameters I told you about, okay? And we consider many machine learning techniques in doing that. The important piece here is that we had to use 170 milliseconds of data in order to accurately estimate those TVs. And that makes sense because of co-articulation I told you about. That the information about a sound is spread over a wide range. Okay, so this supported the fact that we're going to be able to model co-articulation. And this is just showing an example of the tract variables that we estimated up against the ones that came from the synthetic database. And we're doing a really good job there. Now we go from the acoustics to those gestures. That's where you reach the targets. You reach those targets. And we explored different models for that. And we found the one that works best is when we insert the TVs in there as well as the MFCCs. We get pretty good accuracy. But again, in order to do this well, we needed a really large window in order to do the estimation. Okay. We then put that together in a dynamic Bayesian network to do word recognition. And comparing ourselves to a DBN using the state-of-the-art male frequency capture coefficients, then adding the TVs to that, versus doing a gesture-based recognition system, we do much better in terms of word recognition accuracy. So that's just at the word level. We then redid this whole system to do phone recognition, and we found that we greatly reduced the error rate by using those large windows for the MFC, for the tract variables and for the gesture estimation. That was very important. We could get it down to 37.57%. And now I want to compare that error rate to the state-of-the-art, which is the nuance system that's at the core of Siri. And this was a study done back in 2010. There are a lot of differences here, so this is not really a fair comparison, but it just gives you an idea of where we are. This system had a 30.7% phone error rate, but look, it had 1,400 hours of training data. We had 7 hours of training data, okay? It had those triphone acoustic models. We only had the monophone models, but we do have the large contextual windows that we're using. Now, this is conversational speech, so it's got more variability in it. We had read speech, so this is why it's really hard to say this is not an apples to apples comparison. But here they're doing vocal tract normalization and they're doing phonetic rescoring. I think this is a pretty good number. And what we've just gotten funding from NSF to actually develop a full-fledged recognition system that's large scale, and we're going to be able to take advantage of the language model, that's used here. Because my graduate student who did this work now works at SRI. SRI developed Nuance, that's now the core of Siri. So we're going to have access to their language model, which is we're really excited about that. Okay, last part. I know I'm running out of time. This is the speech enhancement work that has resulted in the company that I formed, OmniSpeech. I want to show you a clip now. This is a commercial that started airing about 2 weeks ago.
Maestro, bring it down, please. Better. That's what happens to background noise when you're making a call on this. This microphone here picks up the sounds around you and it helps turn them down. So when the world gets noisy, calls sound better.
I love that. Because it shows that people are now looking at noise suppression as being a differentiator for cell phones. And ultimately, we are trying to get into a cell phone. Now, the difference is he pointed to that second microphone on the back. In our technology, we're trying to do this only with one microphone. And we're also trying to do it purely software, where some of our competitors actually is hardware, so it takes up extra space in the cell phone. I'm just going to play you one example of what, no, two.
December and January are nice months to spend in Miami.
Continental drift is a geological theory.
His shoulder felt as if it were broken.
That noise problem grows more annoying each day.
December and January are nice months to spend in Miami.
Remove the noise.
Continental drift is a geological theory.
His shoulder felt as if it were broken.
That noise problem grows more annoying each day.
Now I'm going to tell you, there are two people here, and I hope you can hear them both, but you may not.
The fight will end in just 6 minutes.
I don't know if you can hear two. We pull those speakers apart.
The fight will end in just 6 minutes.
That was a dominant speaker.
Grace makes up for lack of beauty.
I don't know if you can make out what he was saying. Grace makes up for lack of beauty. I'll play it one more time.
Grace makes up for lack of beauty.
Okay, but whereas you really could not hear anything before, you can now make out what he's saying. So this is our technology that we're trying to develop. This speaker segregation is going to be the second iteration of this technology, not in the first one. So the importance is a single microphone, is software only. And this is very recent. My OmniSpeech colleagues are here. I just want to play something hot off the press for you. Because one of the reasons that the whole field went to dual microphones is because it was felt that single microphones cannot deal with dynamic noise. And what we're showing is, yes, with our approach, we can deal with dynamic noise. So this is highway noise.
In the course of a December tour in Yorkshire, I rode for a long distance in one of the public coaches.
That was from this first one. You can see all that noise there. And this is what we've done to it after the processing. So you're in that silent region. We've removed all of that.
Stop it.
Did I stop it? Sorry. Where is it? Oh, here. Where's my cursor? I'm sorry, I'm not seeing my cursor. Oh, look here. Thank you. It's not showing on mine. Okay.
In the course of a December tour in Yorkshire, I rode for a long distance in one of the public coaches, named the Evening Visit. Coach was crowded inside and out, with passengers by their talk, intensively advanced financial position.
So it's much reduced, okay? All right, so we have one partner, Me Incorporated. This is their app that you can download on your iPhones, also on the Android phones. They have a lot of different vendors. And once you click on one of these vendors, you will get to this screen so that you can now tap and say whatever you're going to say. And you look and see there's OmniSpeech branding. And if you click on OmniSpeech, it says Enhanced Speech Clarity. And if you click on their icon, it says Personalized Speech Recognition. So you're using this app to do shopping at different stores. And we recently did an experiment. We got our first set of data from them so we could judge how much of a difference we're making for them. I can't tell you the company names, but you would definitely know these companies if I were able to say. And we're making here a almost 78% relative improvement in their ability to recognize what has been said. For company 2, this is already very quiet data, so we're not making as much of a difference for that data set. Okay, so we're looking to be to improve the performance of other speech recognition systems. Okay, so now I just want to thank all of my colleagues and show you how many people I've worked with over the years. Primarily, these are my graduate students up top, but a whole lot of colleagues and current colleagues here who have helped me to do all these wonderful projects. I hope I've been able to show you how exciting research can be. You get to work with really great people and travel to great places to present that work. It involves research in a lot of areas, a lot of expertise coming together, which makes it even more exciting because you're learning a lot from your colleagues and you're teaching them as well. So I really want to encourage my students to think about a life in the academy, or at least in research. And I also want to thank my sponsors, a lot of support from the National Science Foundation and National Institutes of Health, also from some companies and from the Department of Defense. And thank you. I'll take any questions. Thank you. I know I'm well over, it's almost 5:15, but if there are one or two questions, I'm happy to answer. No one? Okay.
How different is singing from speech?
Oh, that's a hard one. I actually have not studied singing, but I do have colleagues who are looking at singing. Oh, I'm sorry. What is the difference between singing and speech? And I just admitted that I have not studied singing, but I do know people who do look at singing, and I know that the laryngeal cavity is really important in singing. It introduces what's called a singer's formant that gives it that real vibrato and resonance to it. But that's all I can tell you. Yes?
How does a ventriloquist do all that speech clearly enunciate without moving his lips? At the beginning of the speech, you talked about all the parts that had to work in order to get certain sounds. But a ventriloquist doesn't use all those parts.
Yeah, that's very interesting. You would ask a really hard question there. Let's see. Huh? You compensate. There are ways, yeah, you're right. Bill has already just pointed out. For example, if you ask people, if you insert a bite block into someone's mouth so they can't make all the constrictions that they would normally make, they find other mechanisms to use to get those resonances in the right places. So there are ways in which we can compensate, and that's what's happening also with our glossectomy patients. Maureen Stone, who was here, I'm not sure if Maureen is, oh, she's still here. What she's finding is that some muscles they may not still be able to use, but they can compensate by using other muscles to form constrictions that are needed to produce sounds. Not always. Some of them are tough, like the suh and the shuh. It's hard to compensate for those, but for many other sounds they can compensate. So we do a lot of compensatory behavior when we have to. I thought you were going to ask me actually about people who mimic other people. How can they make themselves sound like other people? And I'll tell you it's not so much that they get the resonances in the same place. What's more important is getting the prosody right. That is the timing, the way that person speaks. And the accent. But amazingly, that can help you to hear them as if they are that person, even though the resonances are not in the right places. Yes?
How about Chinese?
What about Chinese?
Well, how about Chinese voice recognition? I've heard that Chinese words, the same word can have terribly different meanings, but very subtly different sounds.
Oh, it's not so much that in fact, they have fewer vowels. They only have 5 vowels where we have like maybe 16. But the problem there is it's a tonal language. And so it makes a difference whether the pitch is rising or is falling, or if it falls and rises, or if it rises and falls. You got to recognize that tonal part and use that together with the resonant frequencies to do recognition. So that's why that's so hard, yeah.
What are you seeing with people with deviant swallowing pattern? Open bites and deviant swallowing pattern?
Deviant swallowing patterns? Not studied that. I don't know. Yes?
My question is speech because when you speak, you need the wave to propagate.
You say it again?
When you speak, that creates a wave, and that's how someone can listen to the
The air fluctuations, right?
I've been able to make speech with my mouth and my nose very tight. How does that create a wave that propagate?
I'm not understanding because of your accent, I think. I'm sorry.
I've been able to produce sound with my mouth and my nose really close, and someone has been able to listen to it. So how did that kind of propagate? Because I have my mouth and my nose tight.
Your mouth and your nose, what's the relationship?
He said his mouth has been closed or his nose closed.
And then I've been able to make the sound, and someone has been able to listen to it.
How do you able to make the sounds given either your mouth is closed or your nose is closed?
But the front of his face vibrates. That excites the air. Perfectly straightforward.
Okay, you can answer. I still didn't get the question. But you want to answer for me?
Well, that is the answer.
What is it?
In order for other people to hear you, you have to cause the air to vibrate.
Oh, yeah, right.
And so even with your mouth closed,
Oh,
you cause vibrations on the front of your face.
in fact, a lot of times when you're making like those voiced obstruents like duh and guh, the vocal folds are vibrating. And even though the mouth is completely closed, you'll see a signal on the spectrograph because it's radiating through the neck. So sound is radiating through your tissues as well. Your mouth doesn't have to be totally open in order for there to be sound. It'll be very damped, but you can have sound. Yes?
Have you found anything particularly different about those that suffer from stuttering problems? Anything anatomically different, or
Oh.
is it more neurological?
I haven't looked at why they stutter, but we have looked at, I worked with a company once to remove stuttering, to make them more intelligible. So like if they're speaking on the phone, to remove the stutter so that the person on the other end can understand them better. But I have not looked at why they actually stutter. Sometimes I think it's a mental thing, right? And then other times maybe it is something else going on, but I don't know why they stutter, yeah.
It's kind of a follow-up question, but like he asked about Chinese. I was wondering like Arabic and like Farsi, like those are like Arabic,
Yeah, and there's a lot of work going on in those languages.
But like they have like high pitch, low pitch in some of the letters.
Mhm.
You know what I'm saying? They're just separate. The letters are separate.
Mhm.
So the sounds are like more specific.
Mhm.
Like a high pitch letter and a low pitch letter have almost the same sound in English. You understand what I'm saying? Like H, there's 2 H's in Arabic.
And they mean different things if you have them. You hear them differently. So he's talking about in some languages you can produce a sound different ways, and you can hear it in that language, you can hear them as being distinct, but in English we would just hear them the same way. Is that what you're saying? That's definitely true, because if you haven't been trained, some differences you just can't hear. So for example, American English R and L, you'll have a lot of Chinese people who cannot make those sounds because they didn't grow up making those sounds, and they have a hard time hearing those sounds because they didn't grow up hearing them. And so they have to be trained in order to do that. Oh, there's a lot of research in all languages now, right? We have Homeland Security. Everybody's interested in all kinds of languages now. So you have recognition going on in all especially languages like Farsi and Arabic. Tons of research is going on there. Yeah, and you all have sounds that we don't produce. In English, all of the consonants are made in the top front half of the vocal tract. You all make consonants back here. We can't do that. I still don't know how you all do that. See, it would take a lot to train me to do that because I didn't grow up doing that. Yeah. Okay, thank you.